Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming in this morning on the second day of the Parity of Esteem conference. As a constitutional principle in Northern Ireland and beyond is the title of our panel this morning. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists, Dr. Leah Raebler and Professor Colin Murray. Dr. Raebler is at the University of Glasgow. She's a senior lecturer. She joined the school in 2019, and previously she held academic positions in Maastricht, the University of Edinburgh, and UCL. Her research interests are in the areas of international and constitutional law, as well as her relationship with political philosophy. She has written on a range of topics, including the extraterritorial application of human rights, adjudication and participatory democracy, and the theory and practice of referendums. She's the author of Human Rights Unbound, a theory of extraterritoriality, which is published by Oxford University Press in 2020. Professor Murray is at Newcastle. He is Professor of Law and Democracy. He joined Newcastle School of Law in December 2006, following the completion of his postgraduate research at Durham University. Prior to that, Colin taught at Durham and Sheffield. He has written for a range of publications, including The Conversation and The Guardian. Many of his research papers are available on SSRN. I know this personally because he uploads them religiously. And some of his research interests, which cover broadly many topics in public law, include prisoner voting, the Office of Lord Chancellor, and the nature of the UK's devolution arrangements. Of course, some of you, at least, might be more familiar with Colin's prolific recent work on the Windsor Framework, and work that I'm personally honored to be a part of, and which will continue for as long as the framework continues to bother us. So, Colin is going to talk about the incorporation of international law in the context of Parity of Esteem, and Leah is going to talk about the Parity of Esteem as applied to the Jura referendum in Switzerland. So, thank you very much, Colin. And
well, Mudge and Moy, what a day again to be in Belfast, and thank you for making the early session this morning for today's presentation when there is not a small opportunity cost. I note that in our time is running the Battle of Clontarf, which I think is a personal slight that I should be up against this in the running order. So what I'm going to talk today about is the potential offshoots around parity, or potential offshoots of Parity of Esteem, and maybe how they affect the off-ramp from consociationalism. The themes that I want to take on board are, well fleshed out in the discussions that we've already had in yesterday's session. This idea of Parity of Esteem transforming and it being connected to other elements of the 1998 agreement's framework, and that some of those connections are potentially, deleterious or dangerous going forward, or might lock in elements that prevent transitional governance happening. So the idea that consociationalism existed in a space to help a peace-building process and a post-conflict process, but where are the off-ramps put into that? And how does this work and interrelate to concepts like Parity of Esteem as they grow? Now, forgive me, these slides are particularly brightly lit, so any imagery that I've put behind them is now, a faded shadow. But the image on this slide is the civil rights marches of the 1960s, and the particular claim that accompanied them towards equal citizenship, and equal citizenship within the UK. Now, that claim was supposed to front up to the particular issue that Arthur Aughey was raising from the 1980s of that polity as it existed in that time under the Stormont Parliament. And as Aughey said, there was an idea that true and willing citizens deserve special and different treatment in this space. It is an astute realization that this was live in the 1960s as a founding tenet underpinning unionist thinking in the era of the Stormont Parliament, and it is that parity of esteem is intended to work against. And we've seen through Ewan's presentation yesterday, through Tom's presentation, an attempt to unpack what's going on within parity of esteem. And it is that counterweight to an idea that a true and willing citizen is expected to get benefits, or expects themselves to get benefits within a polity over, well, untrue or unwilling, or all of the versions of that came into accounts of this place as a polity. Now, the problem was that that idea, as attractive as it is, equal UK citizenship, and as reflective as it is of even the language of the Ulster Covenant of 1912, is that it only takes you so far. It is a great rhetorical flourish to throw into the debate when saying we're not even being treated as equal UK citizens, but it doesn't get past this idea that true citizens who are willing should get extra benefits in this space. Richard English was able to join us yesterday morning, but wrote pretty influentially in the early 1990s, building on what Augie was writing, that an idea of, well, liberal democratic citizenship in a multicultural polity doesn't bridge the gaps that you are looking for it to bridge in a space like NI. And the problem for Richard English was, well, he didn't see the parity of esteem achieved that either. In fact, he had serious doubts, and maybe a lingering doubt of the sort that Augie has here, over whether or not you can elevate two groups of people who see themselves in different relations to the state, and who one group wants to see the state in its current form dissolved, to anything like an equal footing within a governance order. And if you were growing up in the 1990s here, that was a pretty oppressive reality. An idea that you can reach for something that looks like multicultural citizenship, but don't buy that that will ever have purchase in this place. Or even that the alternatives, like some effort to create a concept of parity of esteem, will bridge this gap, because we can't reconcile that with citizenship theory. There was almost a unique effort to close down the roads out of this conundrum. Now, in terms of parity of esteem's evolution as a concept, Chris, in his paper yesterday, was brilliant on unpacking where this came from as an idea, and I'm certain we'll hear more from Simon on this later today. But the idea of the Upsal Commission report as a popularizing moment mattered, because it counterbalanced that narrative of saying there is no space that's available to talk about this, and it actually got people using the idea and playing with the idea in the general public. This, as a moment of deliberative democracy, I think is overshadowed by subsequent ideas of citizens' assemblies and perhaps their ubiquity, or certainly the celebration of them, particularly in the context of Ireland as a polity. Whereas I think the richer deliberative democratic heritage of events like the Upsal Commission and its efforts at public engagement going back into the 1990s are a really valuable moment to think about, because they got people talking about these ideas. But they also started a process of interlinking ideas, where parity of esteem came to be increasingly connected in public thinking to consociational governance. So, provided that Irish nationalism as the minority community at this time is recognised, and recognition is on a parity of esteem level. It's not the simple base recognition that was there in the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985. This is an elevated level of recognition and respect for aspiration, constitutional aspiration. Then a government of Northern Ireland should be put in place based on the principle that each community has equal voice. Parity of esteem was being put in a preconditional role and was being put in as a foundation of an idea that consociational governance was happening. An interlinkage was happening between these concepts in popular thought, if not always in the text of the agreement, if you go to it in 1998. So we get the rigorous impartiality commitment. But the rigorous impartiality commitment then breaks down into two elements, what I'll call a cosmopolitan element and a consociational element. So there is an idea of rights, social, economic, cultural rights, as underpinning that idea of rigorous impartiality, but there's also a binary community idea. Parity of esteem and just and equal treatment in the identity, ethos, and aspirations of both communities. Both of these elements, the binary community element and the more cosmopolitan rights-based element, working together as underpinning what rigorous impartiality is. And if I was trying to post questions yesterday about that relationship, it's trying to understand how these terms are different and what loads they're expected to bear within these processes. Now, how did that run into actual litigable rights? Well, as Chris told us yesterday, the McMahon case says that at most, we can place some interpretive weight upon parity of esteem as an idea, but it stopped there. It didn't make it into the text, say, of the Northern Ireland Act. It's there within the agreement as something that the Equality Commission should be focusing on. It's not in the actual duties of the Equality Commission within the legislation, taken literally. But we also have an increasing idea from the UK government, as they talk about parity of esteem, that it's entirely bound up in the idea of equality. So again, within that one paragraph of the agreement, we've got a relationship between rigorous impartiality. How is that manifested? It's manifested through provisions protecting equality, rights provisions, and this idea of parity of esteem. One of the first mergers of the concept, the radical indeterminacy of parity of esteem coming to the fore, is in Mandelson's discussions as Secretary of State about what the term did. There can be no second-class citizens in NI. That's why we're doing what we're doing, reflecting parity of esteem between the traditions across the board in relation to a range of governmental activity. We're going to look to change elements of how the presentation and the symbolism in the physical space of this polity work, because we don't think it's reflective of this, and we think here parity of esteem is doing an equality job. Now, that lasted as a consensus for a couple of decades. The phrase, if Chris said yesterday he'd not thought about it too much, it's that this phrase had very little purchase for a long time in the mainstream of public discourse. It faded into the background behind concepts like rights and equality, and Mandelson's statement is effectively affirming that. It comes back to the fore amid a really controversial set of recorded remarks by Gerry Adams in Enniskillen in 2014, where he declared he was going to break his opponents with equality. And that idea of a weaponization of an equality agenda has pernicious impacts for anyone that wants to talk about rights and equality in this space since then, because it becomes seen as being a Trojan horse, and it's talked about directly in those terms. But on the other hand, what's happening here is a simple fact of political arithmetic and political positioning. Because the Unionist parties, by and large, since Adam spoke these words, have been like Sideshow Bob in the Field of Rakes in The Simpsons. There has not been an equality rake that they have not stepped on and had whack in the face. And what Adams is saying is, this can be a basis of us building coalitions. If we are on the right side of a range of equality arguments, taken well beyond a two communities binary position, we will be able to be seen as reaching out across women's groups, across LGBT groups, across racial minorities within NI, and that will help to build our vote base. And if we can connect equality into a wider agenda, it will become harder to resist the things that we want to advance in this space, like, say, recognition of the Irish language or active promotion of alternate constitutional aspirations for this place. Which brings us into the space of the two issues most talked about, or the ones that we returned to repeatedly yesterday, of the kneecap case and the Irish language legislation. Now, the kneecap case is an inherently interesting one, even if we did not reach an end judgment in it. Even if, as Tom says, we were denied the cathartic moment of the judgment that we could unpack and we could understand these principles and we could take through with our students. Because it goes back again to that discussion between Ohi and English in the 1990s. What is a cosmopolitan version of citizenship? How does it apply in a space like NI? Is that enough of a protection when politicians want to play to red-top newspapers? And the kneecap case is evidence that that's insufficient to provide a basic support for that idea of these two communities in NI being treated with equivalent respect in terms of their constitutional aspirations. And that Kemi Badenoch could see hay being made for trying to be seen to be in the face of or blocking public funding coming to a group like NECAP. And she's warmed to that theme in subsequent leadership speeches. We cannot be naive and assume that all cultures are equally valid. They are not. This is of a piece. And it shows the limitations to that concept of multicultural citizenship as driving a political culture on a UK-wide level. Tom and Ewan, in their UK CLA blog post, critiqued some of my work for saying parity of esteem equals parity. And I think it does a really important job when it comes into a space of parity between citizenship rights, between Irish citizens and British citizens in this space that aren't always covered by elements like Section 75. So where that came in the space of, say, the Brexit negotiations and what could be accorded in terms of a package for NI, parity of esteem was in play there. But the one issue that I'll take with their characterization of my work was that parity of esteem equals parity. And if you want evidence of what that would mean, we saw yesterday what parity of esteem, how it got incorporated into the Language Act of 2022. This was an amendment moved by the DUP and strongly promoted by the DUP in Parliament as to what parity of esteem should mean in the context of this Act. I should say this amendment is unsuccessful, but it takes two core ideas. The First Minister and the Deputy First Minister must jointly do the following things. So brings in a community veto element over these questions. And secondly, ensure that parity of esteem is respected in the spending between unionist and nationalist communities. Parity of esteem is a process of weighing £1 on top of another and piling these pound coins up and making sure the piles are equal. This is not about redressing a public space that was weighted entirely towards one community's interest, which does not allow for an idea of parity of esteem as parity of spending. That conception of parity of esteem is live and is increasingly prevalent. And where do I go to blame this prevalence and this increasing interlinkage between the idea of community veto powers and parity of esteem? I go to the one quintessential villain of Irish politics over the last 2 decades. I give you Bertie in all his glory, and particularly all of his glib, off-the-cuff, folksy charm as to what parity of esteem means. Any solution to Brexit has to include the unionist people, because the parity of esteem and the Good Friday Agreement means agreement on both sides. To do a deal through Europe and Britain creates a problem for the unionist community and will be rejoiced at by English nationalists, and it's not really an option. After that speech in 2019, there was repeated reference to it through all leading unionist politicians, touched base with parity of esteem. Bertie of Ahern has said it, equals a community veto over a Brexit deal. And when you move into that space, you are conjoining parity of esteem into the consociational elements of the 1998 agreement in a really powerful and pretty dangerous way. Now, I think it's dangerous because I think consociationalism is a transitional tool. It is supposed to bridge NI as a society moving towards being a liberal democratic governance order. And I think there are off-ramps in it, even though sometimes it can be really hard to see those off-ramps. It can be doubly hard to see them when they become baked in. Petition of concern becomes the Stormont break. And all of that becomes ossified and hardened in the Brexit process. But petition of concern works on the basis of 30 MLAs. And if you track a current unionist vote decline with a set of parties that are not reaching out across the political spectrum, they are not transfer friendly in terms of votes, and an aging demographic that might be described as core unionist voters, you have real problems for a set of parties trying to make a consociational, trying to rely increasingly on consociational governance mechanisms. Chris yesterday had said these have become more of a feature of unionist thinking and unionist debate, and you can see a sudden attraction towards these elements. John Hume very wisely built this in, as Jeffrey Donaldson repeatedly said. But they're built in with a threshold. And at the current rate of vote decline, by 2032, if assembly elections happen on schedule, the unionist parties together as a bloc will just about scrape in with 30 MLAs. At that point, you can do almost anything through a private member's piece of legislation with a simple majority in the Assembly, even if the consociational governance arrangements still cover the dealings within the executive. There are off-ramps here, and there's a real crunch point here that I don't think we're talking about enough. Everyone talks about consociationalism's off-ramp as being reunification. There are immediate concerns that will happen within the next decade of our political life that we need to confront more directly over this. But then, if consociationalism has an off-ramp, why are we building it back in to any discussions about reunification? I'm going to focus on Jim O'Callaghan, TD's contributions to the reunification debate, because he's become an increasingly prominent figure within Fianna Fáil, and also because he's made an effort to grapple with what reunification would look like, and a subtly changing play on it. in a Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge speech in 2021, he very much flagged up the idea of dedicated cabinet ministers for unionists. And he talked about this explicitly in the context of parity of esteem. This speech has disappeared from online, is very difficult to find in transcript form now. Because what you're doing is ossifying in a consociational mode of governance. Instead, if you look at that text of paragraph 1.5 of the interstate agreement, what you have here is a focus on cultural, social, and economic rights. If you wanted a radical alternative model to how Ireland should contemplate parity of esteem and protecting those rigorous impartiality commitments, go to incorporation of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. If you look at O'Callaghan's later speeches, what you get is a much more culturally rights-focused bent. I think there is a space here as to what a polity can do to adapt to this that decouples consociationalism or binary communityism, and that gives a much more cosmopolitan, rights-based set of protections to these arrangements. Now, to finish up, parity of esteem, as we've all heard over the last few days, has this indeterminacy. That indeterminacy, I think, is actually dangerous because it can lead it to being linked into things that are not supposed to last. They are supposed to eventually pass away. And as I said, there are ways that they can pass away by the electoral will of the people of NI. But there is a core to what parity of esteem seems to be doing, and that can be protected in ways that are not intertwined to consociationalism. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much. I'll be speaking about parity of esteem and the Swiss juror question. Full disclosure, I am originally from Switzerland. I studied law in Switzerland. So this is a story about my home, but it's not. I'm not from that region, and I am, and you will see why this becomes important, a German speaker. So take the story with a pinch of salt because of that. I should also say that nobody has ever used the term parity of esteem in this context. So what I'll do to make sense of both the story that I want to tell you and parity of esteem is the following. I'll introduce you to what is known in Switzerland as the juror question. And I'll tell you how a secessionist conflict in the canton of Bern was handled, how the conflict was resolved, how it remained non-violent, and what it meant for the federal constitution. And then I'll suggest that while in hindsight now it looks like, yes, of course, all of it was non-violent, obviously, this was not so obvious, and it was also not inevitable. And I'm picking out 4 moments in the story of the non-violent resolution of a conflict that, to me, suggest it could have gone wrong quite easily, and all of them have something to do with a concept of parity of esteem. Namely, that all of them are instances of how parity of esteem for communities and their aspirations is violated in political processes specifically. Now, I've chosen these points because I find them illustrative, so my reasoning today is inductive. I choose, and it's both inductive and inverse in that I choose moments that are specific, and I'll generalize from them. And it's inverse in that I'm looking at where I think parity of esteem has not been respected rather than where it has. I think that can sharpen our understanding or potential understandings of parity of esteem in processes of conflict resolution particularly, and I'll explain why at the end of the presentation, particularly if we want them to be nonviolent. The image here, I'll be working with images throughout the presentation because I'm assuming you know nothing about this story, and that's entirely appropriate because it's a niche story, it's a small story, but that doesn't mean it's not instructive. The image that you can see here is from 1977. It's the evening of the vote in the canton of Jura, affirming its new constitution. It entered into force in 1979, which marks the first day of existence of the canton. But I'll tell you more about that in a second. So what are we talking about when we're talking about the Jura question? Jura is, you have a map here of Switzerland, it's in the bottom right, and then the little orange bit is what you see larger on the image. That's what is today the canton of Jura. It was originally, when Switzerland was established in 1848, part of the canton of Bern. But this is not at all obvious. In fact, it was the result of imperial territory swaps in 1815 in the Vienna Congress. Why is it not obvious? Well, all the fault lines that Switzerland is more or less well known for overlap here. Language, religion, and social divides. The canton of Bern is German-speaking. The territory of what is now the canton of Jura is French-speaking. Bern is majority Protestant. The Jura is majority Catholic. And the social divides also manifest in different socioeconomic structures, but particularly here between labor and capital, Jura being labor-dominated, whereas Bern is not. This is true to this day in politics. The first and to this day only member of the federal executive who is from the canton of Jura is a social democrat who used to be a member of the Marxist League. So this is true still. In the 20th century, so following the canton of Jura being put in the canton of Bern, the discontent is growing because there is a suspicion that the region is being neglected. The suspicion is correct, so I can see where it's coming from. We'll get to that in a moment when we're discussing Affaire Möckli. This was a 1947 scandal. I'll talk about that in a moment. It is today seen as the lightning rod that led to the secession of the canton of Jura from the canton of Bern. It is also my first entry point where parity of esteem, I think, appears relevant. Then we have a cascade of referendums and the foundation of a new canton and final municipal corrections, again, in many referendums. It's like Anurag said, there was one referendum. It's not true. There are dozens, very many. I'll say something about that in a moment. Then we have final corrections. And the last municipality to change its mind, saying it now wants to join from Bern to the canton of Jura, is Moutier. And it will do so next January. So all of it has taken 80 years. But I think that's a realistic expectation for processes like this, if the expectation is also nonviolence. Here's another map of both the North Jura, what is now the canton of Jura, and the South Jura. There's a little yellow bit in the east of this map. Please ignore this. That one's even more complicated, and in this guy, I decided to skip it for today. If you have questions about the yellow bit, let me know. Here is the rough timeline of what happened. So following escalations, following the affair Mörkli, the Bern constitution had to be changed in order to allow a regionalization of the conflict. Following that, in 1974, you have votes in 6, I call them counties here. The French term is a district, whatever. It's an administrative entity. It doesn't matter for our purposes. So 3 vote in favor of a new canton, 3 against. It's split down the middle. The northern part votes in favor, the southern part votes against. Interestingly, the southern part is also majority French-speaking, but it is not Catholic, it's Protestant. So even though from the outside it would seem that the language barrier is the main fault line, it's not true. I don't think that was particularly surprising, but it was surprising in its clarity. Then there was, in 1975, this is really the interesting bit, I think, that is perhaps what sets this conflict apart from others, including Northern Ireland, is that the system of cascade of referendums allowed, once the provisional border of the new canton was known, it allowed to go into the municipalities that are now situated along the border, asking each of the population in each of these municipalities, so what do you think now that you know the border? Where do you want to be? So that's how it was done, in this order specifically. So first, what is the potential territory for a new canton? Provisional border, municipal corrections along those borders, roughly. Following on from that, the canton of Bern, all of the canton of Bern had to confirm the votes in Jura and did so. This was a major achievement. Only 20 years before, it looked very different. It's one of my Parity of Esteem moments, so you'll hear about that soon. And then finally, the federal constitution had to be changed because this is a canton in a federation. And the first article of the Swiss federal constitution mentions all cantons by name. So that article had to be changed. And it was a very clear vote. I think all cantons in favor and a very clear majority of the people as well. In 1979, finally, the Jura Constitution enters into force. They call themselves La République et Canton du Jura. And they insist on the République and give voting rights to ethnic Jurassians. Not sure what that's about. It's not particularly important because it's 70,000 people, but I think the messaging is clear anyway. This process of cascading referendums, at the time of doing all of this, they made it up as they went. It's now in the Swiss federal constitution in Article 53, but this was not written in until the total revision in 1999. And it says, it gives you exactly what needs to be done, in what order, and in what situation. So you have a distinction between changing of territories and numbers of canton and just border conflicts, and it sets out the different competences. But again, this is not how Jura was founded, but we have this article because Jura was founded in the way that it was and because it worked. If you ever are in Switzerland, just for the image, this is the little booklet of the Swiss federal constitution. It's here, you can see it in all 4 national languages. If you can go to most bookshops and pick one up for free if you're interested. National symbol trivia for you. Right, so now we're testing parity of esteem and how it relates to this process, because it looks like, oh, parity of esteem has been really well respected here. Cascading referendums, lots of patience, lots of goodwill. Everybody was asked in turn. Not so. In fact, in 1947, I think this is perhaps the clearest violation of parity of esteem. What happened, so the man on the image here is Georges Möckli, a Jurassian member of the government of the canton of Bern at the time. He was denied the leadership of the Department of Transport and Infrastructure, being from the region that rightly suspects their infrastructure is being neglected. He had been a member of the government since 1938, and the principle of ancienneté would have suggested that this department was his if he wanted it, but instead the Bernese parliament gave it to a German-speaking colleague who had only just joined. So this is insult to injury. I think Tom yesterday mentioned insult as part of parity of esteem violations. This is one such instance. So what this says is not just, oh, you're different because you're from the Jura. Also, you cannot be trusted with really important questions, and particularly not with important questions that are particularly important for you and your people. Not great, right? Understandably, it triggered protests and anger, led to the foundation of the Rassemblement Jurassien, and ultimately drove secession and the foundation of the new canton. What you see in the image on the right is the demonstration, the protest following Affaire Möckli. It's about 2,000 people. Doesn't sound like much, but it's in the town of Delémont in 1947, and that town had 7,000 inhabitants. So you have 7,000 residents, 2,000 of which are on the streets. That's not great either, but understandable. How is it relevant for parity of esteem? We have the involvement of authorities, and there is open discrimination supported by political and administrative processes. So there's legitimacy claimed for the insult. That makes it especially poignant, I think. Here, the next phase of parity of esteem violations, I think, starts in, there was lots of going back and forth in the years following Affaire Möckli. In 1959, I think is a good example, there was a vote held in all of the canton of Bern denying a potential vote in the region of Jura. So you ask everyone, do you want to allow this small minority to have self-determination? That is not an expression of parity of esteem because it predetermines the result and instrumentalizes a process for conflict resolution to do anything but. So yesterday, I think there was a suggestion that parity of esteem may be interpreted as a unionist veto on anything. That is, with respect, not a great idea, given this. This led to a phase of protests, anger, and violence. So there was some militant violence. I have here an image for you. It's the emblem of the Groupe Bélier. That's the militant youth organization of the Rassemblement Jurassien. And if you have some imagination, the emblem looks like a ram, the animal. That's because Bélier translates to ram, both the animal and the battering kind. They're active to this day, and particularly in the 60s and 70s, were frequently involved in mass brawls with anti-secessionist youth groups. So, but their protests range from the classical to the witty. Here is an example of the witty kind. It's from 1972. We have members of the Groupe Bélier pouring concrete into tram rails in the city of Bern, protesting, you guessed it, the neglect of transport infrastructure in the Jura. They do have a point. The last bit of the motorway connecting Switzerland, the rest of Switzerland, and all of Jura with France was opened in 2017. You can make of that what you will. Right, we also have the classic protests in 1977 in Moutier. They looked like this. an image probably not unfamiliar. They really do all look the same, don't they? Moutier is important even as late as 1977, because remember, we're already in the founding days of the new canton here. But Moutier had said it doesn't want to join the new canton, even though it is French-speaking. So even after the foundation of the canton, we have what I call partiality complaints. So in 1987, the Canton of Jura applies to the Federal Tribunal because it has come to light that in 1977, remember those municipal correction referendums, the county votes, Bern had not entirely transparently supported its own side in a violation of parity of esteem. Here we see the relationship I think parity of esteem has with rigorous impartiality. So sometimes they work together, but it's also, if you do it intransparently and you instrumentalize processes that were meant to do something else, it's not just about impartiality. It is an insult. This was how it was perceived in the Canton of Jura. How dare you? You promised us this was going to be fair, right? So it's more than just impartiality. Finally, in 2017, so we're now coming very close to the present, Moutier changed its mind and wanted to join the Canton of Jura, voted in favor, but the Bernese authorities quashed the vote. So they quashed a vote that went against them themselves. So that's also a problem of impartiality, but it's a particular problem because you were a judge in your own case. So there's no parity of esteem there. These examples, I think, suggest that parity of esteem means different things for authorities in charge and for those who are a majority in any given time, at any given moment, and those who want to influence processes in their own favor. You see here on the map, the little bit that is sort of shaded and orange, that's Moutier. It's quite large. It's a large municipality for that region of Switzerland, which is why it was so political, even though it's essentially a village. What does all of this mean for parity of esteem? So to me, it suggests that parity of esteem has a moral undertone. It has to do with a fundamental recognition of whatever might be at stake, somebody as a fundamentally recognizing somebody as a member of government, fundamentally recognizing constitutional aspirations, a need for impartiality and transparent governing, whatever it may be. It is both, I think, relevant in substance and perception. So it's important to have actual substance in parity of esteem. But even if there is a perception that it may have been violated, I think the examples that I've just listed have, they suggest that that's already a problem. So there is a relationship, I think, with respect, so sort of a deeply held respect. Yes, you are from the Jura, but we trust you to make decisions for all of the canton. I mean, this is important if you have members in executives from, say, Northern Ireland in either a UK or an Irish government, depending on what the situation may be, right? And then, so we have determining factors that we can distill from that. Parity of esteem and what it precisely means in terms of actions that are demanded of you depends on whether you're a party to the conflict or whether you're more aligned with one side on something. Whether you're the majority, so it captures power relations. I imagine it a little bit equal to heckling. So if a very powerful person interrupts somebody petitioning them, that's very different from a minority citizen heckling a famous politician, right? So your parity of esteem requirements are different. Like if you already hold all the power, your obligations are more onerous. That's what my examples, I think, suggest. It's particularly important in processes of conflict resolution. In a way, most political processes can be understood in that way, but referendums on changing territorial allegiance are particularly important in that regard. And do not, whatever you do, try and intransparently or improperly influence the result in your favor. Also, do not claim a veto, right? So that's the sharpening bit. It's more than impartiality, even though connected. It often requires an affirmation of respect. The image you see here is from 2021. You see it because of the masks. It's the citizens of Moutier celebrating the result of the repeat vote of 2017. They will be joining the Canton of Jura in January 2026. Some conclusions. I've so far talked about the Jura like it's only a map and flags and so on, so I thought I'd show you what it actually looks like. This is a picture of the municipality of Saint-Ursanne. It's in the northernmost district of Porrentruy, but pretty much the geographical center of the region. It's typical for the building style, and also the mountains in the background are very typical for that region of the Jura Mountains with the ridges of almost white rock. The conclusions I want to present are as follows. Now, I'm not denying, and I think spending so much time on the details of the history of this conflict makes this obvious, that historical context, the nature of the conflict and fault lines make huge differences. So there is a contingency that also, I think, translates to parity of esteem. What parity of esteem requires in any given conflict situation is contingent. That's fine, so we don't need to generalize everything. However, I would say that parity of esteem or something like it, even if nobody uses it, the substance of it is very important for non-violent phases of resolution, either in preserving them, in creating them, or in running them. For that, that's just when it gains heightened importance and where sensitivity, I think the story of the Jura really recommends. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Colin and Leah. So we've got roughly 35 minutes for questions. We will be finishing on time no matter what happens, just to be very clear. Some people prioritize the quality of a conversation over time. I'm not one of those people. You're in my panel. Welcome. Anyway, so before I throw open the floor to questions, I would like to abuse my privilege as chair, again, my panel, by asking two questions myself. One each for Colin and Leah. So for Colin, you sort of contrasted cosmopolitanism with constitutionalism, and is cosmopolitanism the kind of terminus of parity of esteem? Is it in that sort of transitional way? Are you saying that once we get to a cosmopolitan liberal democracy, that's it, no more parity of esteem required, effectively? And for Leah, we heard yesterday that certain concepts, we heard yesterday in the context of the Good Friday Agreement and the Northern Ireland conflict, that certain concepts can be understood independently of parity of esteem, and what does it really do as a concept? And I just wondered, from the perspective of the Jura question, would things like some of the conclusions that you were coming to, respect being a key point, would this sort of disaggregation of respect from parity of esteem have A, either changed the outcome, or B, been kind of better managed within the conflict? Or I suppose, yeah, actually, that is my question. Thank you. Yes, and I think we'll take a few questions from the floor. Yes, Devyani. Sorry.
Speaker. Oh. Yes, for Colin, I've found the quote fascinating about the true and willing citizen, and I wonder if it ever came up ever again in the parity of esteem kind of discussions, because it kind of reminds me of the loyalty allegiance framing of citizenship, and how problematic that's been in a lot of national security issues. So I'd be really interested in hearing more. And Leah, I really want to visit Jura now after seeing you develop this story over time. I feel like it's beautiful. But with respect to parity of esteem, I was wondering, we see the breaches, but is there a basis for this concept in the Swiss constitution? Like, is there the question of the constitutional principle? I personally am not that hungover over it because I've been using it more from the recognition and parity of political recognition and being able to have a voice and all those kind of more theoretical background. But given that we are seeing it used in a quite doctrinal constitutional basis, I wondered if we find that in the Swiss constitution anywhere.
We have two questions each. Will we do those before taking any more?
Right. Thank you so much, Anurag. So respect and parity of esteem, whether it would have helped manage the conflict, I think what has ultimately helped manage the conflict is historical luck, and that Switzerland already had ideas about how to run referendums, for example, not finding that particularly strange. Already knew consociational government. In fact, Bern was a pioneer in this form of government, having adopted it even before 1848. That's the date the first Swiss federal constitution was adopted, following a civil war fought along Protestant and Catholic divides, by the way. So just to add that. Does that answer your question? It's just, I think it's an interesting historical lesson, I think, of when a conflict that is well managed could also have been derailed. But what helped manage it is just, also time. It's 8 decades. A lot of people who had very strong views at one point were gone at another point, right? So, frankly. So it's historical luck and time, patience that helped manage it. Maybe there's a lesson in that too. Would you like to go for the next one, or should I take Devyani's?
No, you're on a roll.
Okay. Devyani, thank you for the question. Definitely visit. It is very nice. Really nice. Parity of esteem has no basis in the Swiss constitution, but regionally diverse representation does. A history of consociationalism and federalism does. All of which points to the recognition that you need to be able to represent different perspectives, even if that means amplifying minority voices. So this is why I went about it the other way. So what can it tell us about, if you want to define parity of esteem, what are the moments that could tell you something about what is particularly important if you find parallel lines to the conflict that you're interested in, right? But there is no doctrinal base. And as I was saying, as they were doing these referendums, only the last couple of votes in the 21st century took place after Article 53 of the Federal Constitution was actually put there. Everything before that was everyone affected just did whatever seemed most reasonable at the time. Sometimes that worked really well, and sometimes it didn't. So no, there is no doctrinal basis, but I thought actually that was a strength of this story rather than a weakness, because you can do with it what you want, and also you can draw the lines that you want and find parallels or differences that suit you, right? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those questions. Anurag, is consociationalism gone to a cosmopolitan endpoint? Well, cosmopolitanism is the end of history, dude. We don't need to worry. This is all sorted. We got there in the 1990s. Yeah. The thing is, if we abandon that thinking, we still see parity of esteem doing a job. And if we think about what reunification might be, and I think it's incumbent on us to think seriously what it might be. There's a loyalist refrain of, and it's my favorite loyalist argument about reunification, is why would I swap Tories in London for Tories in Dublin? And there's an idea of a liberal constitutional order that isn't doing things for working class communities up and down this island. And so if you were to incorporate the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, it not only gives you a basis for litigating over cultural disputes and being able to put those arguments into the public domain around Article 15 of the Covenant, it also lets you litigate housing rights. It lets you litigate a wide range of socioeconomic rights that are promised there in the agreement. Rigorous impartiality across a range of political, economic, social, and cultural rights. It's there and it is never fully delivered upon. But I think there is a version of cosmopolitanism and a rights-based approach to this that can actually do much more of a job than we have ever let rights do in this space in either polity on this island. And if we're serious about what parity of esteem means in the context of a new Ireland, well then a mandatory unionist minister in government in Dublin, the 2021 Jim O'Callaghan model, is not, it's taking all the wrong lessons from parity of esteem being connected into consociationalism and trying to confect something that would speak to those elements within a reunified governance order, but would actually change nothing about that order. Would change nothing practical on a day-to-day basis. Whereas I think if you're going to think about it seriously, no, you want a different form of cosmopolitanism and rights-based discourse to do that work. And then, Devyani, Arthur Ohi starts his book with a 5-page diatribe, and I'd say that starts the book, but this is a notably acerbic book. But this diatribe is aimed at unionism at the time, and it's almost the fetishization, I've lost my ability to speak with hay fever, of a sort of an inarticulate ability to promote your worldview. We're just a common sense set of parties. That's what we believe in. And it comes back to that Keynesian idea of, well, whenever someone says that, they're in hoc to some dead philosopher somewhere. But there wasn't a willingness to attempt to systematize and label what was happening. You get a lot of discussion around the equality of employment, debates that run into the 80s and 90s of course, we should be able to preference the choice of loyal workers in the workplace, and in an era when economic power very much vested in one community, the direct effect and knock-on of that was palpable discrimination in employment practices. But what Ohi is trying to do is give at least a scaffolding to what that means in this context when he talks about this idea of the true and willing citizen. And in the context of a contested polity, I suppose it gets you into that dangerous space. It very much would lay was taking through in her paper of it lets you exert dominance over other groups in society if the majority is able to clasp itself onto that notion and say only we embody that notion.
Thank you. Yes, Colin.
One question for each of the speakers. Colin, there is a single clause in the Good Friday Agreement setting out parity of esteem, no matter who's sovereign. At the moment, that's power sharing, lots of stuff about identity and ethos. A hypothetical flip, Dublin comes in charge, and you want to interpret that clause as all being about respect for socioeconomic rights and to forget all the identity and ethos thing and power sharing. Now, loath as I am to indicate huge sympathy for Fianna Fáil ministers and statements, isn't there an obvious problem there? Aren't you obviously contradicting yourself? Aren't you, whether you like it or not, stuck with a parity of esteem clause that makes the sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander? That what is now, what the British government is committed to in Northern Ireland now is what a future Dublin government in a hypothetical United Ireland is going to have to deliver in respect to Northern Ireland, absent some major rewriting of the entire process. And that's my question for you. Are you trying to wriggle off the hook of a very clear textual commitment? And for Leah, really, really interesting study, and we've discussed it before. I was struck by your characterization of the sort of the Byrne government as the dominant actor. Now, I'm just sort of curious, would all actors involved in the Jura dispute regard the Byrne government as the sort of dominant actor? Or would there be minorities within Jura who would have wanted to stay with Byrne, who would have actually seen the Byrne government as upholding, helping them in this context of them feeling themselves to be a potentially beleaguered group within the new Jura settlement? So I'm curious, were there different accounts as to who is the dominator, who's the oppressed minority, who's the vulnerable minority? Was that switching over time?
Okay, there was another hand up for questions.
This is a question to Colin. And just reflecting back on the Good Friday negotiations, I don't disagree with you at all. And in terms of trying to up the social and economic, but obviously we can't lose the sense of culture and identity. But I was thinking of Brendan O'Leary, John Carey and colleagues' research, which they talked about just not that long ago here, and their surveys of attitudes and assemblies, and putting that proposal about guaranteed membership among the government here, and how when different options were explained, people actually changed their position from, for example, in a confederal system representing Northern Ireland or Ulster into actually representing the unionists within government within that. And I wanted to put that in the context of the reality of negotiating a change, an agreement, in the sense which the objection to consociationalism after the agreement was made, we would never have got the agreement without the arrangement that came in the agreement about sharing power and all of this, and a number of those guarantees within it, which obviously we need to evolve over time. So I'm just wondering about your point in the context of the realpolitics of negotiating change before and after any referendum might take place.
Shall I go first this time? Okay, the wriggle offline. I don't see an incorporation of this as the magic wand that does everything in terms of what would be a rigorously impartial state after statehood changes in the context of NI. I think there are a whole range of things that would need to be done in terms of debates over symbolism, emblems in the polity, right down to what we discussed yesterday about elements like Article 9 and what loyal citizenship is in the context of the Irish Constitution. But I don't think there is anything within Article 1, Paragraph 5 of the UK-Ireland bit of the 1998 agreement that requires consociationalism or those sorts of consociational governance structures to exist in perpetuity. And I think what can protect parity of esteem most effectively is the ability to have litigable cultural rights in that context as part of incorporating a tool like the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. I think there is something to be said for changing the way the polity works in that way to give people litigable protections in this context, which are much more effective than anything that might be described as window dressing fixes within a governance order. And I think at this point, when everything is still up in the air, we need to actually take a conference on parity of esteem and take it to be, well, what could that mean? What are the range of possibilities for doing this? And if you look at paragraph 1.5, it sets the standard of rigorous impartiality. It then says, in the provision of this range of rights, and in equality, and in parity of esteem. These things are all there. It's trying to find the different bridges to getting to an end point where you could say the current state with statehood over NI reflects parity of esteem or embodies it within its governance structures. Now, again, is that all that would need to be done? Clearly, if there are protections around people who are British citizens and don't want to adopt Irish citizenship, clearly there need to be much wider discussions as to who gets voting rights in referendums in the context of Ireland. There are multiple things that need to be done here. I'm saying that one pillar of that is to look at how social, economic and cultural rights operate in the context of a new polity. And then what's the realpolitik of getting us to this endpoint? I suppose a lot of my presentation is about that idea of realpolitik. And Brendan O'Leary has put out this idea of 2032 as the change year, as a tipping point year in his latest book on it. And I'm not sure I agree that on his presentation of the numbers, 2032 will be a tipping point for a majority supporting reunification if you look at the way the numbers are at the moment. But it could be a very different tipping point. It could be a tipping point for consociationalism, because the entity that we regard as political unionism, those parties might not be able to control the petition of concern and stormont break mechanism in a way that they currently do. And then we are in a very different space as to what governance here will look like. And I think that tipping point is reached before a tipping point comes on lots of people who what are embodied by the other label within NI politics are persuaded, if they are persuadable, on reunification. So that comes first, and it's coming crashing towards us that consociationalism is not permanent or fixed in stone and will not work in the same way that it has worked up to this point, if it can be made to work at all on that basis. But if it can't be made to work on that basis, that's the entry point to actually having these debates and having them live in people's day-to-day lives.
Thank you. Any other? Yes.
I think Liz.
I think-
Oh, sorry.
I
Sorry.
think Colin wanted to know about Byrne as a dominant actor. Yeah, this is a great question. I'm particularly grateful because I can now add a little bit of the story that I had to leave out in my presentation now. Okay, so it's really a question, I think, about, well, what would have been done about these new minorities created, because that is what happens in processes like that. The answer is the absolutely rigorous regionalization of the process. I had one slide with sort of a lighter orange bit that is now the canton of Jura and the darker orange bit in the south that is the part of the region of the Jura, also French speaking, but now not a part of the canton. Now, these people, Protestants, would have been the new minority in the new canton of Jura. But because the system of disaggregation of the referendums allowed disaggregation on district and municipal level, this outcome was avoided. So the price is high. It just prioritized citizen sentiment over territorial cohesion at every point. To municipal level, we're talking villages with 200 residents. But it became clear between 1947 and roughly 1970 that anything else was not going to fly. Interestingly, though, the federal councillor, so the member of the federal government, who is from the canton of Jura, Elisabeth Bohm-Schneider is her name. She grew up in Les Bois, deep French-speaking Jura, but was born to German-speaking parents. And yet she entered the federal government as a proud Jurassian, her words, not mine, and the Jurassians were out in force in front of the government building in Bern, which is also the seat of the federal government, not just of the cantonal one, waving the Jurassian flags. So even if you're a minority in the new canton of Jura, they will celebrate you like that. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but the answer is a really unique, historically contingent move in regionalizing it.
What? Oh, what? Yes, no, I'm getting to you. Sorry.
Who's first?
Jesus.
Because isn't.
I want to follow. Thank you both for your very interesting contributions. I want to follow up on the question of Colin to Colin. So I agree with you that consociationalism is not set in stone, and also that parity of esteem doesn't mean necessarily consociationalism if there is a change in the sovereign parliament. But if we agree, if we go back to the taxonomy of Professor McRuden, and if we agree that parity of esteem also points to this idea of constituent peoples, shouldn't there be something more than the enshrinement of cultural and economic rights? There should be some kind of recognition in the political participation. It can be a system of non-territorial autonomy. It can be a system of participation in the government. But it seems to me that just enshrinement of economic and social rights is not enough to actually give value to parity of esteem if we change, if there is a reunification of the island.
Can we take Chris's question, please?
Thank you. This is a fascinating discussion. Leah, thank you very much indeed for it. Two very quick questions. First is, I didn't pick up from what you said what the resolution was of the complaint that went to the Federal Tribunal, because that's an extremely interesting constitutional development, particularly in light of discussions about impartiality in this context. So I'd be very interested to know what the resolution of that complaint was, and in particular whether there's a text available for that decision. On the question of the municipality village by village decisions in terms of the radical devolution, as it were, of the decision making, translating that into the Northern Ireland context, and I know you weren't doing that, but I'm doing it. We're back to the Boundary Commission of 1926 or whatever. And the problem, it seemed to me, to arise from that is essentially ethnic cleansing. That is, there is a considerable incentive, if it goes municipality or village by village, for severe ethnic cleansing to occur. Why did that not occur in the Swiss context? And the answer, of course, is the Swiss are nice people and we're not. But is there anything, yeah, exactly, is there anything more to it than that, right? Why did that not happen? Colin, I don't know what to make of your very interesting intervention. So it's partly because I'm confused about the switch from when you're talking about a United Ireland scenario, unification scenario, to what you're talking about in terms of the current situation in Northern Ireland. Yeah, talking about an off-ramp for consociationalism in the current context seems mighty strange, I have to say, because we seem to be a million miles away from that. But maybe I'm missing the point here. I mean, not only is it sort of a million miles away from it, it's also highly destabilizing to talk about off-ramps at the moment, I'd suggest. But leave that aside. That's simply a matter of political judgment. The more interesting question is to follow up one of the previous questions and to think about the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Convention. And of course, your point is well made. The Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Convention isn't only about economic, social and cultural rights. It's also in Article 1, self-determination. So I'm not sure why, as it were, transferring the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Convention, if you're talking about it as a whole, into domestic law or into a future governance structure in Ireland solves the problem. It simply redirects the issue to who are the people when we're talking about a right to self-determination. So let me press you a bit and ask you who you think the people that get self-determination are in Northern Ireland and in a future possible unification scenario. So are the people, the whole current citizenry of the island in some way or another? Are they, and that would be clearly one element in a nationalist understanding, at least from one perspective, or are they the Ulster Scots, or the British Protestant people, or Indigenous Irish, or the New Irish to be included, or who are the people in your scenario of incorporating Article 1 of the Convention?
You have 5 minutes.
Oh, good. If I go first, and Nikos, if I take your question, I roll it in with Chris's second question. The idea of whether it's the interest or not to talk about an off-ramp for consociationalism, I think it's gotten to the point where we're not talking about things that are potential political realities. And there are potential political realities in the near future, within the next decade. Sometimes discussion of consociationalism here as a mode of governance can seem like a permanent fixture. But my concern with this paper is to say, no, we need to be live to the fact that the petition of concern mechanism exists on a basis of 30 MLAs. And there has been a steady 3.5% to 4% decline in Unionist first preference vote share over the last 5 elections. And by that logic, and on by a 2 electoral cycle window, if you project that on through, by 2032, by 2035 at the latest, depending on when elections fall, the vote share will crash under 35%, and there will not be 30 MLAs generated to generate a petition of concern. Now, that then causes issues of if things can be pushed through by private members, processes separate from the executive, whether or not there is buy-in for power sharing in this place. We need to talk about how power sharing works when those building blocks, or when those blocks that have been seen to be central to it are contingent upon the votes of the people of this place. And when I'm saying that, I'm saying that that might happen long before, or potentially will, there is a majority in favour of reunification. That the decline in first preference vote share and the lack of transfer friendliness of the TUV, UUP, DUP at the moment is an issue about the stability of the current model of consociationalism. I think if we don't talk about that, if we hide away from it, we are going to crash into a sudden reality in under a decade's time, and that is a very short window in terms of constitutional thinking. I think the second question, well, I don't think that there needs to be any relitigation of what is the base unit for self-determination. We've particularized it. We've particularized it in clear terms within the 1998 agreement. What would then happen if we move into a space where there's reunification is that, well, that would then sit as being the island of Ireland, as being the new polity at that time. Now, I know there's a so what implicit in the shrug of the shoulders, or is there something else implicit?
Why is that the inevitable conclusion? I don't understand why it would be.
Oh,
If
no,
you talk
well,
about the self-determination of peoples,
yes.
you know it better than I do, that is an enormously controversial concept in international law, and one that's never really been properly defined.
Yeah.
So you incorporate an uncertainty into the very structure of the incorporation of your preferred agreement.
Okay.
Great answer.
If we take in those terms, I still think that you can speak to this as a set of questions. That yes, there is an indeterminacy around them in terms of international law and their meaning, but there has been a particularization of them within the context of this island that I think remains useful and will remain the starting point of those discussions. Now, the last thing, Nikos, to take your point on, is where does this all go? Or is this sufficient in itself? Well, no, I don't think it's sufficient in itself, but I think we're currently doing it by proxy. I think we're seeing an increasing amount of litigation over whether or not flags are flying over war memorials on certain dates that are being channeled through mechanisms of judicial review that aren't adequate to deal with the actual questions about clashes of cultural rights that are live within those, and that there is a potential to deal with some of these issues by litigable rights that reflect that in a way that current judicial review doesn't. I'm conscious that I am short on time, but again, I don't think this does everything in this scenario. I potentially think it does something in this scenario, and that we need to be live to that in a position where business as usual, for all it might be comfortable, and at sometimes desperately not comfortable, doesn't reflect the political reality of where things are moving.
Right. Standing. It was decided on standing. The federal tribunal complaint. The canton didn't have standing. Very elegant. I know. So it was only concerned voters in the votes that actually took place could have complained. The voting rights complaint is one of 3 categories of constitutional complaints in a weak constitutional review system. that Switzerland had standing. I can look up the decision. There, it might be somewhere. I imagine it will be in French, which is fine. Better for most people than German anyway. And why did ethnic cleansing not happen? Well, luck again, or luck, knowledge that the southern part of Jura, which was also French-speaking, would not want to join a new canton. So the border now diffused one of the fault lines, right? The new border. So you don't have an overlapping fault line anymore in the sense that now language and religion are separated out. That's the first reason. And the second reason, well, it kind of did happen anyway. The German speakers just left. So if you look at, the, when I said about the demonstration following Affaire Möckli in Delémont, the German name, it does have one, is Delsberg. I looked up the population development and the demographic development. In 1910, it was almost half and half German and French speaking. In 1947, it was almost half and half German and French speaking. That starts to change in 1970. So the population number of German speakers and Protestants has remained stable, but French-speaking Catholics are now by far the majority. So it kind of did happen. It's diffused by the fact that we're talking small spaces and the same country, right? And the fact that there are parts of the Jura that are also French-speaking or sometimes German-speaking. So it was diffused, but I think as a price, that's probably usually not adequately represented, as a cost to how it was resolved. So thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you. We are now at an end. We're a little bit over, but that's okay. If anybody has any lingering questions, comments, whatever, please do the convivial thing and take it into the coffee break. Thank you very much. We will be back at 11:30, I think, because 25 minutes is long enough for coffee, for our next panel. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Leah. Thank you.